Good morning. Canadian agriculture has been a front runner for adopting new technologies to minimize the carbon footprint that is left behind from crop production. We, the prosecution, argue that under regular growing conditions, tillage should be subject to carbon taxing. There is sufficient evidence that proves that with today's farming equipment, conventional tillage is not a recommended practice in Western Canada. Evidence also shows the benefits of minimal disturbance of the soil as compared to deep tillage practices. Taxing tillage will help to contribute to Canada's carbon sequestering efforts, furthering efforts to maintain environmental sustainability. In today's regular growing conditions, conventional tillage methods must be accounted for as carbon emitters and taxed accordingly. With a growing global population and increasing demand being put on food production, efficiency must continue to be the foundation for current and future ag production.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ryan, and this is my debate partner, Nina. We're here today to argue against the claim that agricultural tillage should be subject to a carbon tax. There are many benefits for farmers who decide to work their land. Turning your soil is a good defense against weeds, diseases, and other insects from invading and damaging your plants. Tilling also helps break down weed roots along with the homes of other insects, helping to prevent these pests from intruding your soil. Cultivation is also a common practice when breaking previously unseeded land such as pastures, low spots, brush, tree, or old yard sites. Working hard ground is essentially the only way to alter the soil profile to turn it into arable land ready to be seeded. Throughout our research, we have found that in certain regions of the world, despite having the highest global carbon tax prices, the policy has had minimal impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, we do not believe tillage should be subject to a carbon tax, and it should remain the farmer's decision on whether or not to work their land.
Without a break from tillage, a total breakdown of soil structure is possible. Soil organisms can be affected, bringing microbial activity to a halt. Soil pores are closed, imposing severe limitations on infiltration and increasing runoff. There may even be some initial loss of productivity with modern levels of erosion, with frequent tillage sustained over a couple of years. Topsoil loss begins to exceed replacement. In time, the soil is in danger of yield setbacks due to organic matter and nutrient loss, as well as the damage done to soil's physical properties.
It is true that tillage does induce surface runoff and soil erosion, especially in particularly wet years, but the benefits greatly outweigh the costs in many cases. Oftentimes, people believe that any kind of cultivation is deep tillage, greater than 3 inches below the soil. In many cases, this is not true. Every plow or pro-till has a depth setting, which many farmers use to just barely graze the ground in order to smooth out equipment ruts and seed rows, allowing for smoother operating conditions in the future. This practice is also a good way to minimize organic matter buildup come springtime, allowing farmers to minimize the risks of air drill troubles with clogged lines, which could lead to uneven seed or fertilizer placement, causing problems down the road, such as weak plant stands or germination issues.
Since 2014, the tillage effects over greenhouse gas emission are controversial and uncertain because increased sequestration induced by conservation practice is often paired with reduced CO2 emissions for soil. Based on this statement, how can this practice be under the carbon taxation?
Canadian farmers who have adopted conservation farming practices such as zero tillage and direct seeding over the past 20 years are contributing to Canada's overall objectives of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The techniques which eliminate or reduce tillage and crop production play a dual role in capturing and storing carbon in the soil. First, plants such as grain, oilseeds, corn, and forage crops take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis and store it in plant structures. Second, the absence of tillage slows the breakdown of plant material on both soil surface and in the root zone, therefore slowing the release of carbon back into the atmosphere. Implementing a carbon tax on the entire Canadian economy has been in the news over the past 2 years. We are proposing that only tillage systems specific to agriculture be accounted for this tax. How would this negatively affect the overall economy when agriculture only accounts for 7% of Canada's GDP?
The Norwegian economy has among the highest carbon tax rate in the world at $51 American per ton. This is 3 to 4 times higher than most other regions of the world. Despite the politically ambitious carbon tax, this policy measure has had only a modest influence on greenhouse gas emissions. The study done by Annegret Larsen proved that emissions only decreased by 2.3%, which is not an efficient mitigation strategy as it does more harm to the economy than it does reduce emissions. A carbon tax on tillage would only decrease the Canadian economy. So imposing a carbon tax isn't an efficient mitigation strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Carbon tax will place restrictions on energy demand through an increasing price signal. In China, the reduced demand of energy is expected to lead to a cost increasing owing to carbon tax and transfer to energy demand side. What are the strategies to avoid this unwelcome effect on the carbon tax?
Western Canada, specifically Saskatchewan and Alberta, are main contributors to the energy sector within Canada's economy. Particularly large amounts of energy are needed to generate power on oil platforms because the efficiency of the process is very low. Accounting for this efficiency could help lead to investment in innovation of new, more efficient technologies. Possible negative impacts on the GDP from carbon tax are not obvious for the reason that the tax revenue will be put into the economic system that can offset GDP loss to some extent.
The government of Saskatchewan reports that tillage should not be recommended practice in the province due to the adverse effects it has on soil composition. Only certain soil types within the province are suitable for tillage because of the effects it has on soil moisture content, especially in saline soil areas. What other methods aid in soil conservation that are appropriate to implement on Canadian farming operations?
Although deep tillage is not recommended for saline soils, like you say, it can be very beneficial to solonetzik soils, otherwise known as gumbo land. Gumbo soils have a tough, impermeable hardpan varying from 2 to 12 inches below the soil surface. This hardpan severely restricts root and water penetration of the subsoil, causing crops to have a wavy growth pattern. Deep tillage offers the greatest aid and improvement in such soils, which occupy approximately 4.5 million acres in Saskatchewan.
Study shows that after 7 years of contracted tillage practice, reduced tillage significantly increases greenhouse gas emission. By the soil, which means CO2 flux 2 times larger and means N2O flux is 10 times larger than emissions measured in conventional tillage. How do we expect to measure this difference in order to impose a fair tax on producers?
In the big picture, the agriculture sector has a relatively low share of global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, but agriculture has a greater potential of reducing greenhouse gas emissions through facilitating sequestration of atmospheric carbon dioxide into soil organic matter by reducing rates of mineralization stimulated by soil disturbances through the adoption of conservation agriculture like term no-till. Carbon sequestration is an important process in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Through chemical conservation, 1 ton of soil carbon can produce 3.67 tons of carbon dioxide.
What are some innovative technologies for effective use of land resources and agricultural chemicals that would help eliminate poverty and malnutrition significantly mitigate GHG emissions from agriculture?
I think the use of tillage is the most beneficial to farmers in aiding them and grow the crops that they do. So if you're looking at reducing poverty in third world countries and such, tillage is your best benefit, your best tool to keep your yields high and excel farmers as they go about their daily practices. Like Nina said, an article we found from the Book of Soil and Tillage Research published in 2006 examines results over 7 years of contrasted tillage practices, and reduced tillage significantly enhances greenhouse gas emitted by the soil. This attribution was attributed to higher soil organic carbon and total nitrogen and a larger bacterial biomass in the uppermost soil layer, caused by limited burying and mixing of crop residues. These experiments prove that reduced tillage is only able to increase sequestration within the first 10 centimeters of topsoil, but reduced it at greater depths.
Without accounting for how the revenues from a carbon tax would be used, such a tax would have a negative effect on the economy. The higher price because it would diminish the purchase power of people's earning, effectively reducing their real wages.
Revenue from a carbon tax on tillage systems must be put back into agriculture. We do realize that Canadian farmers operate with tight margins, but sustainability must be a key driver in the efforts to continue protecting our environment. Carbon taxing is a fairly new concept to both Canadian farmers and government officials. If structured and applied to the appropriate production methods that have shown to emit more carbon than sequester, a carbon tax has potential to account for these losses.
Research has shown that agriculture has great potential for carbon sequestration. Reduced tillage systems are to thank for these advances in environmental sustainability. The long-term experiments that have been conducted in North America have proved that arable lands that have been changing from carbon sources to sinks by conservation management such as reduced and no-till practice, manure use, rotation, and introducing cover crops. From the viewpoint of agriculture management, we must continue sustainable development and realize the carbon sequestration potential is crucial to both crop production and carbon mitigation. Implementation of additional taxes are never in favor of those being imposed on. If farmers and agriculture organizations can provide and be allowed representation during carbon tax policy development, a favorable solution for both sides has the potential to be created and implemented. Revenue from a carbon tax can be invested back into the economy to mitigate GDP losses and further investment into innovative technologies for further sequestration as well as energy and crop production. Adopting new policies that ensure long-term sustainability is crucial to the long-term success of agriculture production.
After exploring several studies, experiments, and other data collection, it is apparent that the results between zero tillage and conventional are too insignificant to differentiate and determine which one of the two has a larger contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. The goal of a carbon tax is to give the public an incentive to reduce and minimize the generation of CO2 within the atmosphere. Although we have observed a selected few greenhouse gas emissions decrease after such a policy has been implemented, it is just not a larger enough reduction to sustain the burden of carbon tax, as it can lead society to an economical collapse. The effect of tillage in the rate of carbon sequestration and mineralization of the soil are still unclear, since some method issues have been identified in previous studies. There are other more impactful, less economically damaging solutions for greenhouse gas mitigation out there. Taxing a tool as valuable to farmers as tillage is not the answer.